Hello and welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by Pest Management Professional and Control Solutions Incorporated. I'm Rick Aldrich from North Coast Media, the publisher of Pest Management Professional magazine, and I'll be your event manager. Before we get started, I want to let you know that today's webinar will be recorded. You are currently in listen-only mode. The recording will be available 2 weeks from today on our website. A link to the on-demand recording will also be emailed to you when it is available. At this time, I'd like to acquaint you with the ways in which you can participate during today's presentation. Please notice in the lower left-hand corner of your console that there is a Submit button. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Just type in the text box at the bottom left, then click Submit to place your question in the queue. Questions that were submitted during registration may be covered in this webinar. Some questions may also be answered in an upcoming issue of Pest Management Professional magazine or in one of our weekly e-newsletters. We strive to answer as many of your questions as possible. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties during today's event, select Help to submit your issue, and Assistant Producer Joelle Harms or I will personally assist you. Now I'd like to turn today's event over to our moderator, Managing Editor of Will Nepper.
And this is Will Nepper. I'm Managing Editor for Pest Management Professional, PMP. We're very happy to have Marie Knox with us again today, Technical Manager for Control Solutions Incorporated. And without further ado, I will let Marie take it away.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Rick. Will, you sounded so excited, too. Welcome, everybody who's on the call and viewing the webinar with us today. Today we are going to cover, it's a pretty broad topic, and it's a lot to cover in an hour. So we're probably not going to touch on each and every tiny aspect of it, but I hope that today, talking about termites and building construction, that you'll be able to walk away with maybe an additional way of thinking about the building you're going to treat, the structure, how the termites may have gotten in, and how you might be able to use that to your advantage when placing your treatments. All right. Today's agenda. What we're going to cover is a brief review of subterranean termites. We're not going to touch on drywood termites today. If you do have specific drywood questions for me, at the end my email will be available, and you can also reach me through PMP Magazine. So feel free to send me any and all of your drywood termite related questions through that manner. We're also going to touch on a relationship of termites and various construction types. We'll look at the different slab types and their related issues, like where termites get in and how. We'll look at construction types, so what's above the slab, and the related issues with the materials and with the methods. And then we'll close with some main items to remember. So depending on where you're located in the country, termites can be found in various areas of structures depending on construction type. As an example, in colder climates where basements may be prevalent, termites are commonly found in the basement or cellar areas. They can be in the structural timbers immediately above the cellar walls, which would include the mud sill, the studs, the floor joists, the subflooring, and the floors themselves. Termites can also be found in wooden elements including posts, steps, door frames, and trim. And again, this isn't an all-inclusive list. Anything that's wood or cellulose-based is definitely a target for termites. And any wood embedded in an earth or concrete floor is especially susceptible to termite infestation. As we go through the program today, we're going to have a lot of visuals. So we may have some slides that are mostly words like these, but hold tight because we'll have a ton of visuals so that we can illustrate exactly what we're talking about. Any cellulose or wood materials that might be covered by earth or resting on the ground may also be attacked by termites, including wood siding, especially if it's really close to the grade or below grade, window frames, door frames, wooden steps, maybe deck steps or decking. This is all susceptible to termite damage. Houses built on concrete slabs oftentimes also have the flooring and the framework in the walls damaged by termites where the termite infestation is extensive. And I kind of have a treat for you. We have some great photographs from down here in South Florida of Formosan termites and some pretty extensive damage. So if you're in, which I know we have people from all over the country calling in today, so if you're in other parts of the country and you haven't had the pleasure of working with Formosan subterranean termites, you're going to get to see some really neat stuff. So going back to the presentation, termites also like to keep warm just like us. So back up in colder climates, they prefer areas around furnaces, chimneys, hot water heaters, and hot water pipes that provide warmth during the cold months. So each of these things that we're going over in these slides is really just more of a mental checklist for you to think about where to inspect or where you might also find termites if you're having difficulty locating your infestation, depending on where you are and what construction type it is. And believe it or not, termites are builders too. They are tunneling, excavating, earth-moving developers whose main purpose on the planet is to decompose cellulose. Unfortunately, termites also want to consume and destroy cellulose that we need to keep intact, specifically in our homes and our structures. Termites are considered among the most destructive insects in the world. They readily attack cellulose-based materials and damage such diverse plants as trees, grasses, and various crops, as well as structural wood products like homes and other buildings, utility poles, fence posts, furniture, books, and papers. If it's cellulose, the list can be endless for termites. In the U.S., the economic impact of termites is tremendous, but also rather difficult to quantify. Estimates have ranged from $1 to $2 billion just for annual cost of treatments alone. That doesn't take into account the extent of damage, and that can reach up to $5 billion or even more. So let's take a look at some of the termite damage capabilities. This happens to be a classic photograph, and again, just as a side note, the illustrations and photographs you will see, a lot of them are available in that treasure trove online called Google Images. And this one happens to be one that you've probably seen over and over again. It's classic subterranean galleries filled with mud. This one is courtesy of the University of Nebraska. Another classic photograph you've probably seen before are subterranean termite mud tubes. Now what I want you to think about today is that historically we all were taught to do an inspection of the exterior of the structure in addition to the interior, but on the exterior we were always simply looking at that foundation line and looking for mud tubes. Well, they're not always going to be there, and that's really one of the main points of today, is that there are some cryptic, hidden, discrete entry points into a structure. There's actually many of them for termites. So you're not always going to see a mud tube. That's why it's good to get this little X-ray vision look into construction and into the elements of construction so that you can think a little further ahead or a little deeper, if you will, to figure out where your termites may be getting in, especially if there's not a mud tube in sight. So for those of you who have seen Formosan termites, you know what voracious eaters they are. They are considered a super termite. They've been referred to as a super termite. They build these amazing carton nests in structures above ground, especially when they have a secondary moisture source. So they are a subterranean termite, but they are very well known. In Florida, in the Panhandle, Louisiana, stretching over to Texas and a couple other areas, Formosans are highly active. And if they have that secondary moisture source, maybe gutter moisture. Maybe your customer hasn't cleaned their gutters in a long time, and it's holding moisture and slowly seeping into the eaves area, or there's a slow leak in the structure that maybe the homeowner isn't aware of, but it is enough to sustain this aerial nest or aerial colony of Formosan termites. And this is what the carton looks like. You'll see wood at the bottom of the picture, and the carton itself is made of secretions, fecal matter, and anything that the termites have consumed, as well as mud. And they're very hard. They're very hard and difficult to break up. Now, getting into what I had alluded to before, this is some pretty extensive damage. The photographs taken here are courtesy of a company here in South Florida, J.P. Miller & Sons. So I wanted to thank them for their photographs and their work. And this happens to be a clothing storage warehouse that they were called to. And you'll see that some of the wall has been cut away. And on the left-hand side, the picture on the left, you see that in between those two 2x4s that are inside the wall, it's completely filled. And it actually is completely filled from the floor all the way up to the ceiling with the carton nest, and it stretches up even further than that. The picture on the left here shows more of that wall cut away, the floor at the bottom, and the termites stretching all the way up into the ceiling and into ceiling beams and wooden trusses. So wrapping up damage, it can be extremely extensive, and finding out where the termites are getting in can be difficult. That previous building was a slab on ground. It was a monolithic slab. So moving into construction, subterranean termites may enter structures through a number of methods, a number of entry points. Any wood-to-ground contact is a no-brainer for a termite entry point. Any expansion joints, seams in the slab, cold joints. Now the difference between an expansion joint and a cold joint, I'll just tackle that now before we get into the slabs. An expansion joint has some sort of expansion material in between two different pours of concrete. So it's like two slabs that could be touching each other, but they have an expansion material in between. A cold joint does not have any expansion material. It is two separate pours of concrete that have cured at different times. So when that happens, concrete doesn't stick to other concrete. If you've tried to patch maybe your garage floor, you'll realize that that patch will chip up rather easily. It doesn't glue itself. New concrete doesn't glue itself to old concrete. So when you pour two different slabs at two different times and you expect them to butt up right up against each other, you're actually, as that second slab cures, it creates a space, and that's a cold joint. And also cracks in the slab. All slabs crack, so be very aware of that. It doesn't matter what kind of a slab it is, they all have settlement cracks. And that's another very easy entry point for termites. A building element, hollow blocks, concrete blocks, they can get up straight through undetected through hollow block voids. And even when those blocks might be poured or attempted to be filled with concrete, it's not perfect. There are always going to be gaps and small areas for termites to find their way. Any plumbing or utility penetrations in the slab, those are great entry areas through the slab or through block. And then also behind stucco. Here's my favorite. Stucco, veneers, wood siding, vinyl siding, EIFS, which is an exterior foam insulation or exterior finishing insulation system, which we'll take a gander at that in a few slides. But I kind of liken this to putting layers on the outside of the house. So when the building is built, then they add all these decorative layers, if you will. And with each layer, they tend to run that layer all the way down to the ground. And then when they grade, so some terms I will go ahead and define just in case some people on the line don't know what I'm talking about. When I talk about grade and final grade, That is when the structure is complete and maybe they put stucco on it or brick veneer, and then they grade the soil up to the base of the structure. And a lot of places have building codes on how the grade has to slope and whatnot. But the fact that they push additional soil up around the outside of the structure, a lot of times they cover the bottom of the stucco, the bottom of the brick veneers, the bottom of that exterior finishing insulation system. And what you have is a direct secret entry point for termites. So the termites will just be tunneling in the soil, and they can come up. They don't even have to be exposed to outside air or anything. The second they can find that little gap between the layers of, maybe stucco and concrete, or between the brick veneer and any sheathing, they can actually tunnel up in that space and we'll never see a mud tube. So there are some codes and some rules about cutting away these outside layers and maybe exposing 6 inches of the foundation wall. But we're not going to get too far into codes or anything like that today. Again, we don't have much time, and this is a really vast topic. We could probably do a webinar every month of the year and not fully cover everything that we would want to. So all of these things we just mentioned in the previous slide, in order to put a really great treatment down, if we're talking about liquid treatment, would be pre-construction. Pre-construction treatment is the best time to effectively treat all of these construction points. But it's also not without its own set of issues. I want everybody to hopefully embrace the fact that nothing's perfect. We're dealing with Mother Nature, and none of us are perfect beings, and our treatments are never going to be perfect. So each thing that we talk about really will have its own set of issues, but as long as we know them up front, then we are better prepared to handle them when any sort of issues arise. So now let's take a look at specific construction types. We're going to begin with the base of the structure, so starting at the bottom. We'll touch on crawl spaces, take a look at some pictures, and point out certain elements. We'll look at basements, and then we'll jump into the slabs, supported slabs, floating slabs, and monolithic slabs. So again, you may recognize some of the pictures. They're all available online. This happens to be from the University of Florida. Kind of an oldie but a goodie. This is Crawlspace Construction, and it's kind of like that side slice view. I really like these drawings. So what you have with a crawl space, just think of the name. It's basically a space most likely big enough for you to crawl into. It's not a basement, but it's similar, if you will. So a crawl space has a space, a gap, if you will, an air gap, between the soil surface, or maybe they put gravel down inside the floor of the crawl. There's a space between that floor of the crawl and the subfloor and floor joists of the structure above it. You still have a footer, which you see in that left picture, which is generally concrete. And then you have a foundation wall. And that foundation wall can be poured concrete, or it can be hollow block, or it could be hollow block that's then poured to fill it. However, if you take a peek at that picture on the left, you'll see a bunch of yellow arrows. Those are the entry point areas for termites. They could come up through a crack in the footer and make their way straight up through hollow block to the girder, and oftentimes it's wood. And the girder, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, is the space between the pier or the, it's actually a sill plate when it's on top of the foundation wall. And that is what the floor joists and then subsequently the subfloor and then the flooring rest upon. And if you look at the left-hand side with those yellow arrows on the very left, you could imagine termites just happily tunneling toward that foundation wall. And when they hit it, they generally will trail up, and that's where you would see them come up, emerge from the soil, and build a shelter or mud tube up the side of the foundation wall. But again, that doesn't always happen. And then it's also a good thing to point out, looking at this, If you recall, on liquid applications, liquid termiticide products, they all read that you treat to the top of the footer. It's very important because think about if you didn't find the true top of the footer and your treatment only went, say, halfway down, and those termites, say there was a crack where the bottom yellow arrow is, say the termites tunneled and didn't decide to go up into your treatment, they just simply kept going because they found a crack, got into the hollow block foundation, and straight up into the structure. So that's why it's very important to treat to the top of the footer. And we'll touch on how to find the real top of the footer later in the program. This is a really nice drawing. I give Foundation Master credit for this drawing. Again, have fun. After this presentation, go ahead and Google up some construction images. It's really great. You could form your own training manual for your inspectors and your technicians and your sales guys to help them see just what's going on at certain structures that they go to sell or to treat. So this is a beautiful crawl. And again, it's just a drawing. This one looks like you could almost stand up in it, but don't expect that. If we have a lot of people on the line who have dealt with crawl spaces, you've probably been on your belly crawling in a crawl space and come face to face with snakes or raccoons or rats or any other little varmints. It's definitely not a clean, pristine area like this drawing would lead you to believe. But this is a great drawing just to learn different parts. So the outside exterior has the foundation, walls, as well as footers. And then in this particular crawl, it shows you a footing for the center beam there. So you can have pier or beam. That's what they would also refer to it as. And then that holds up that floor girder. And the floor joists run across and are supported by the foundation walls and the sill plates, as well as that girder down the center. If only all crawls were this nice and open. Taking a look at a real-life crawl, on the picture on the right, you see that girder going in, that man's leaning on it. And you also see the foundation wall in part of the photograph, as well as floor joists that are going on. And they're resting on the foundation walls, on the sills, and across to the girder. And one thing to keep in mind is it's not a far distance for termites to make it to that much wood. This is a pretty good-sized crawl, but not all crawls are this deep. So think about that. And then the other thing to think about is when you have piers in the crawl, the pier is resting on generally a concrete or block footing, but that pier itself can be metal, can be wood, it could be poured, it could be a preformed pier. But a lot of times, especially with older construction that you're going to run across, it's wood. And so some of these elements, it's pretty dangerous when termites start to damage them, simply because we're talking about the support structure of a house or a building. Taking a look at just the girder itself and how it's run across the open crawl, we did already mention piers inside the crawl, that they rest on footing, and then you have your pier, and then you have these anchors, and a lot of times it's just a wood 4x4 or bigger, depending on what code is where you are and what the code is, the building code. But oftentimes it's wood, and that's maybe 12, 16 inches from the soil. So again, not very far distance for termites to go ahead and tunnel up that footing and pier in the crawl space, which, by the way, is protected. You know, your homeowner's not always walking around under there, and that is something that if you're doing an inspection, you're going to have to get in there and inspect to look for that type of activity. But that would not be a far distance for termites to tunnel up and get directly to a wooden beam. So taking a look at basements, I like to think of them like a giant crawl space. I grew up in upstate New York, and I am the daughter of a builder, hence why I really dig building construction. I'm not a builder myself, but I grew up on construction sites, and I built a lot of very ugly little houses for my Barbie dolls with wood scraps provided by my dad. So basements are near and dear to my heart because that was primarily the foundations that he was putting structures on in upstate New York. But I like to think of them like a giant crawl. So a basement pretty much will have, I have seen some gravel floor basements, but most of the time it's a poured concrete floor. And it's some great living space if you are in the north or in the Midwest or where you have basements. It's a great living space when you have it finished. It definitely adds size to your house, but not impervious to termites. Just to take a gander at the pink insulating foam, they have that sandwiched below the soil. It's insulating the entire basement all the way around, and it is stuck to the poured concrete walls of the basement. And then some basements are block wall, which we'll take a second to look at some of that. But again, it's like a giant crawl. You're still going to have a girder. In this case, you see a metal post. And most of the time with basements, you have metal posts holding up the girders. And then the floor joists go on just the same as a crawl in most cases. But the deal is you see the wooden sill plate going on right there on top of the top edge of the basement. And you can have termites, and studies have been done at UF and at other universities looking at building construction elements and termite preferences. And they have shown that termites will happily destroy the pink foam board insulation that you see there in the photograph. They'll tunnel through it. They'll chew it up. They'll use it to incorporate into additional tunnels. And that is a pretty secret little hidden away entry point. They could be tunneling into it and coming up in between the pink foam board and the poured wall straight to the wooden sill plate. So this is something to keep in mind, and when we're doing our inspections, it's always good to have a shovel, pulling away soil, seeing what may be a little bit below the grade, behind the soil level, and what we might be encountering or what could be hidden from our initial view. This is just looking at poured walls in a basement. Some of the walls may be poured. Oftentimes, that's what I've seen the most. But again, there's wood elements involved. And also there can be, this is an addition. The previous one was an addition as well. This is concrete block used for the walls. And don't worry, the plywood in the picture is just simply keeping the dirt from all the soil from rushing through and back into the basement. There's most likely going to be a window or some access point there in that basement wall. Now looking inside the basement, we referred to termites. They're a lot like us. They want to keep toasty and warm, especially in colder climates. And they like to, you'll find them, I would say, in areas where you've got some additional heat or moisture, and that could be around some plumbing, some heat or air conditioning duct work. And so inside this basement, you can see plumbing and utility pipes, as well as the exposed floor joists. Now think a couple steps further. What if there's a crack in this wall? Or what if they did tunnel up some part of the exposed, maybe top foot or 6 inches of the basement wall and make it directly in to the sill, straight to those floor joists. They could also be following, and I've seen them tunnel and build tubes surrounding the water pipes, especially when it's for heat. So keep in mind, and not normally, most basements don't have a bunch of wood stacked up inside them, but this was new construction. So you can see from up underneath what sometimes people do a drop ceiling in their basement to cover up the subfloor and the joists that are above it, but there is an awful lot of wood there for termites. And oftentimes in basement structures, that's where you're going to find them. All right, moving away from crawl spaces and basements onto the slabs. Slabs are great. A lot of the wooden elements can be even closer to the ground for termites when slabs are considered. So a supported slab is the first one we're going to take a look at. Simple differences between supported slabs and floating slabs. A supported slab is just that. It is actually supported by the foundation wall. So the block that you see is the top run of block of the foundation wall. And we'll look a little further in a few slides. But you'll notice there's a notch cut out of it, and that the blocks are specifically made that way to be used for supported slabs. That red clay soil that you see, that's where a slab is going to be poured directly over it. And then the outer edges of the poured slab is going to rest on that soil as well as rest on that top run of block of the foundation wall. So that is what makes it a supported slab. Looking at a drawing so you can see, as if there's no soil there, you see the poured footing. This happens to be a poured foundation wall, but you could envision it as the concrete block that we just saw in the previous picture. But you see the notch at the top where the edge of the slab is supported or rests. And that's a supported slab. Taking a look at another one of these oldie but goodie drawings from UF. All of the yellow arrows show you all the many places that the termites could get in. You see cracks in the slab as well as cracks in the footing. Crack in the footing, they could either find their way in between the footing and that first block and go straight up through hollow block. They could go through in between the runs of block. That's where that second arrow on the left is. They could traditionally hit that foundation wall if they were tunneling from the left and then go up and directly into the wall supports. And if this happens to look like wood framing construction above, then they would make their way straight into the wood. Plumbing penetrations, not sure if I mentioned that. Any sort of utilities, anything penetrating the slab. So there's a number of places and ways that termites can get in. Think about if that crack in the slab was underneath an interior wall, and that interior wall was wood frame. Even if it was metal frame, there's a lot of wood support in metal frame. And I'll show you some pictures of my own construction that has been taking place over the last year or so in a few slides. But think about that. That's a very cryptic, hidden entry point, straight up through a crack in the slab, in which I have cracks in my slab. I got to see it from clearing part of the lot all the way up to, I'm living in it now. But there are lots of cracks. I know where most of them were before the flooring went down, and I'm sure there's a lot more cracks that have occurred, settlement cracks, since the flooring went down. So a very hidden entry point for termites, where you wouldn't see the traditional tubes up the outside the foundation. Now moving away from supporting to floating. I know this was one of the questions, actually I think it was a couple of the questions that came in during registration. So like Rick had mentioned in the beginning, we cover a lot of the questions in the presentation itself, so the questions that come through early. So you got to see what a supporting slab is, and a floating slab is just that. You might laugh. It's not rocket science. The way these terms they came up with them. It just simply floats. So it is not supported by the foundation wall like a supported slab was. It's actually floating, poured within the border of the foundation wall, if you will. It's actually floating either directly on the soil or some ground fill that might be there. And it has all of the same susceptible points as a supported slab. So you have all of very similar entry points. And a note about plumbing and utility penetrations, something that is used when your slab's being poured, it looks like a a giant paper towel tube. So you know your cardboard tubes inside your paper towels? Well, think of one that's like, 12 inches in diameter or more. And they actually nestle that into the soil around where the plumbing penetrations are. And they do that so when they pour the slab, that they have the ability they have some wiggle room. So just in case they put the plumbing penetrations maybe 6 inches to the left or 6 inches to the right, they can actually move them easily after the slab's been poured. And once they decide that the plumbing penetrations are in the correct spot, then they go ahead and mix up a little bit of concrete and then fill in that area. But they leave, a lot of times, that cardboard is stuck to the concrete that cured, or the team that does it just leaves the cardboard in place and they just cut it off at the top of the slab after it's all been cured. So sadly to say, I do have some cardboard lodged in my own slab at my house. So that is something to keep in mind. Not only are plumbing and utility penetrations in the slab some conducive areas for termite entry, but there's also, in the case of my structure and a lot of them out there, there's been a little added snack of some cardboard cellulose for termites just to help them on their way as they find their way to the utility and plumbing penetrations. It's unfortunate, but it happens. Looking at what a floating slab looks like from above, that's just a run of block, and instead of the block having that recessed cutout like in a supported slab situation, it just simply, the floating slab just butts up against that foundation wall. And floating slabs can have expansion and cold joints, which we did talk briefly about, which offer yet another route of entry into a structure for termites. And oftentimes the expansion joint can run underneath interior walls. So you would have an expansion joint. The termites can find entry through that expansion joint and straight up into an interior wall, which a lot of times the interior walls are wood frame. And our last slab that we're going to look at is a monolithic slab. Mono meaning one or single, and it is a single pour. So you don't have that separate poured footer and separate built or poured foundation wall and then separate slab pour. It's actually all done at once, and the ground is the mold that is used, if you will. So the ground is shaped and dug out. There are form boards put in place, which we'll take a look at in a second, and then they're supported by another rim of form boards, and then the concrete is poured and it takes the shape of whatever was dug out. So you have a foundation and you have a slab, but it's all one, and they have extensive settling cracks in monolithic slabs. And you also have plumbing and utility penetrations. Now, one thing you're going to notice is there's no footer. So like you would normally see if you were digging down the side, if you're going to do a trench, say you're doing a liquid treatment. And by the way, for everyone listening, we're really not going to focus on specific treatments, liquid or baiting today. Obviously, that's completely up to you. And I believe in a toolbox approach that each one of your structures is probably going to need a different prescription, if you will. So I will probably refer to liquid in a number of ways today, but just so you know that we're not going to get specifically into products, if you will, or treatment methodology, or get into the debate on that today. But what you look at is, so we don't have that footer. So if you are going to do a liquid treatment and you're going to dig a trench, even if it's a small trench, and then you're going to rod through that trench to the top of the footer, think about our liquid termiticide labeling language. It always reads to the top of the footer, do not treat below the footer. So how do we make sure that we're not treating below that foundation with a monolithic slab? Well, newsflash, we have to go ahead and dig down. First, there's two reasons. Actually, there's probably more than two reasons, but I'll give you two. You got to dig down and find the actual bottom of that foundation because you don't want to treat below it. But you also want to find the true bottom of this foundation, or a supported slab, or finding the top of the footer in a supported or a floating slab. A, because the label language says you have to treat to the top of it if you're using liquids. And B, think about those drawings we saw. What if a termite is tunneling in? And what if this bottom of the foundation is 2 feet below the soil? And you only mixed up enough product because you assumed that it was 1 foot deep, and that's all you needed. What if the termites, instead of hitting the foundation wall and tunneling up into your treatment, especially if it's a non-repellent, they wouldn't know it was there, but what if they chose to hit that foundation wall, tunnel down, and circumvent your treatment, popping up underneath the slab and getting in through a crack or around the plumbing penetration? That's why we need to treat to the top of the footer, and in the case of monolithic slabs, find the base of that foundation. It helps us with proper pricing, proper amounts of product that need to be used, proper gallonage of water depending on what product you're choosing. And it helps us in the long run avoid those issues when you do a treatment and you scratch your head and wonder why they swarm again the following year. So just some food for thought, things to keep in mind. Looking at a monolithic slab being pre-treated here, again, courtesy of Google Images, you see that the soil is forming the form or the mold for the slab. Now you see that there's already a slab poured, and this is going to be added to it, and there'll either be an expansion joint or most likely it'll be a cold joint. So there's going to be poured side by side, and because that first slab had already cured, the second slab is not going to stick to it. It's going to cure and separate a little bit, leaving a tiny little cold joint, a gap between the 2 slabs. But you see that the foundation that you saw in the previous picture is a deeper indentation there in the soil. Now this is kind of a little bit of a difficult picture, but I wanted you to see the form board set up. This is an addition. This is an extra slab going on to that structure. And you have the initial form board set up, and then you can see the vapor barrier or the plastic barrier, and the slab is going to be poured on top of that. You see rebar crisscrossing through that area. And in this outer corner that's closest to you in the photograph, you see kind of a big indentation where the plastic kind of goes down. And depending on the size of monolithic slabs, they will pour what they would consider a footer, and it's a larger area for support of that slab. And the outer row of form boards is simply to keep the inner form boards from blowing out when the concrete's added and poured and as it cures. Now, touching on some of the decorative elements before we get to what's above the slab. And again, these are difficult. These are difficult to deal with because they offer a number of routes of entry for termites, especially when these outside decorative elements extend below the grade, below the level of the soil, because it just makes it that much easier for termites to gain entry into your structure because they don't have to expose themselves to outside of the soil realm. They can just quickly go right up in between, in this case, a brick veneer and a concrete block wall. They could also go up through the voids in the block or through the voids in the brick. Taking a look at what I had briefly mentioned before, the exterior insulation finishing system. It's often referred to as synthetic stucco, but EIFS is not stucco at all. Stucco is a completely different process, not without its own issues, but EIFS is a lightweight synthetic wall cladding that includes foam plastic insulation. Again, termites will happily tunnel through it, and a thin, several layers of thin synthetic coatings. So it may end up looking similar to stucco a little bit when it's done, but it's not real stucco. And they use a glue to glue basically styrofoam to polystyrene to the structure, to the outside sheathing, and then they will screw it in as well to attach it before they start adding the layers of coatings. And again, each time you're adding layers and layers to the structure, you could possibly, especially if it is extending below grade, you can be offering up secret hidden entry points for subterranean termites. So touching on some of the problems with slabs. To wrap up slabs, monolithic slabs have extensive settling cracks. Floating and supported slabs have perimeter interior seams and expansion joints. In many cases, interior walls might be over those expansion joints. They could have hollow block masonry foundation walls as well, another entry point. All slabs and foundations can have plumbing and utility entry points through the slab. They can have cracks in the slab, below ground veneers or stucco or EIFS, and also any cold joints or separate pores. Let's talk briefly. We did mention it. Well, we didn't mention overpour, but we were talking about why it's really important to find the top of the footer earlier when you're doing a liquid treatment. Overpour is something that is quite common. So when that slab is poured, a little bit can squeak out, if you will, into the surrounding soil. It can squeak out underneath the, and squeak's my very specific term I'm using today, but it can seep out underneath form boards, if you will, and it can form a little shelf. So it's like a little shelf of concrete. It could be, 4, 6, 8, 12 inches below where you see the top of the slab. But the problem with overpour is that it's not the footer. So when you're doing an inspection and you're using your probe or a shovel to find the top of the footer, you might go down a foot and hit something hard and think, oh, my footer, the top of my footer is 1 foot deep, when in reality it could actually be deeper than that. So it's good to probe and dig in several points around the structure to make sure that you're truly finding the top of the footer and that you're not just hitting overpour. They're supposed to, the overpour is supposed to be knocked off right after it's been cured, but it doesn't always happen. In fact, I have overpour at my house right now. Stucco below grade is a big issue. Wood to ground contact, form boards left in place, which we'll take a peek at a picture, and the EIFS system that I mentioned, also issues with just building construction in general, but also with slabs. Roots and pipes or rocks can make soil trenching difficult if you're doing liquid treatments, so be sure to at least use your rod or use a backfill method. Make sure you don't leave any untreated gaps, especially when you're doing that perimeter part of your liquid application. And then mystery backfill. It might include leftover wood from cuts, concrete chunks, lunch leftovers, cans, bottles, cups, paper, styrofoam containers, you name it. If it is construction debris, it costs your contractor or the construction company money to move debris away from your house. So the more of those dumpsters that they need to fill up and have removed, the more expensive it gets for them. So it's actually cheaper for them just to kind of sweep all of the mystery backfill under the rug or under the soil, if you will. And unfortunately, a lot of it can be cellulose and can provide food for termites and lead them to your structure. So some of the usual, unusual issues: construction debris, like we mentioned, the wood cuts, form boards left after the pour. If they're stuck to the concrete and it just seems too difficult for the crew to remove, they just leave it in place and push soil up around it, unfortunately. Cardboard forms left in place, like what I mentioned around plumbing penetrations, styrofoam and paper food containers are oftentimes left in the backfill. I can't tell you how many times I had to run around the site and clean up even when there's garbage cans in place for garbage to be thrown away. So a lot of it ends up in the soil around the structure. A quick peek at a form board that has been attacked by termites and it was left in place there. And then unfortunately, just FYI everyone, that picture on the right-hand side, a 2x4 does not make good expansion joint material. What this tells me is most likely the homeowner either they poured the slab themselves, or they hired somebody who didn't necessarily either respect code or understand it at the time. But expansion joint material should be of a non-cellulose nature. So now let's take a peek at what's above the slab. This is cool. Now, I mean, I spent a lot of time on slabs, but I love this part. The structure's base or foundation is not the only thing we need to be concerned about. We need to think about what's above it. Is it wood frame construction? A lot of times referred to as stick built. I grew up calling my dad a stick builder, and a lot of people wondered what planet I was from. But my dad started off in wood frame construction, and it has been referred to as stick built construction as well. How about concrete block construction, like down here in the southeast, and especially in Florida with all of our hurricanes and in hurricane-prone areas of the country? There's a lot of concrete block construction, but it is not impervious to termites. And then steel and metal frame construction, super cool. I got some neat photos for you. But there is still a lot of cellulose, a lot of wood in the last two types of construction, so do not be fooled. So here's wood frame. To me, this is beautiful. This is what I grew up seeing. And it's also quite beautiful to termites, as a matter of fact. I mean, if you were a termite, this is like the filet mignon of structures for you. Tons of wood, I mean, almost smack on the ground right there. And in the right-hand side, you see that glorious wood subfloor and all the plywood that's been going up and cladding the structure and all those wood interior framed walls inside. So this is wood frame construction. I don't think I need to spend too much time on it. That's a termite's dream. Now moving to the polar opposite, steel frame. This looks like something out of Terminator to me, but pretty cool stuff. There's a lot of advancements in construction and construction materials. But I will let you know that a lot of wood goes into even these metal, if you will, houses. You end up with plywood up on the roof, and you might say, Marie, that's a really far distance for termites to make it from the soil to the roof. And yes, it is. However, it's not impossible. When we saw those Formosan termites in the beginning in those pictures, it's not impossible. And let me tell you, there's going to be a lot more wood than just what's on the roof in this structure. Oftentimes they clad these metal frame structures with wood. So that's kind of, not necessarily defeating any purposes, but it's letting you know that there's an awful lot of wood that's going into the structures. And then there's other elements that can be a mix of metal and wood. These are some really neat trusses, roof trusses, and I hadn't seen them before until I was beefing up and building the presentation for you guys. These are some pretty spectacular trusses. I'm kind of in love with them right now. They look phenomenal to me, and it's a marriage of wood and metal. So very sturdy looking, look like they're made for massive, expansive roofs, but still there's wooden elements there. Now concrete block construction, biggest joke ever. There used to be, I'm not sure if they still run, and I'm not saying that that concrete block is a big joke, so please don't misunderstand me. I love it. That's my own house right there. That's an addition that went onto it. But there used to be these commercials that would run on the radio in Florida, supported by a Concrete Builders Association or the Concrete Block Building Group, and they would say it's termite proof, which is very funny because it's not. It's absolutely not whatsoever. I mean, it might look like a castle, but it's not termite proof. You see the wood roof trusses going on, for one thing. And then when you take a peek inside, it might have some metal frame interior walls and metal framing inside, but on the inside of the concrete block exterior walls, you have furring strips, and that's what they attach the sheetrock or drywall to. And then in the interior framing there, you see 2x4 support systems around doorways leading directly up to those wooden trusses. And on top of it, now you can't see it in the picture, but since this is my structure, I know where the crack is. There is a crack where you see some kind of water near the bottom of the photograph. There's actually a shadow going off to the right, and there's a nice long crack there, a settlement crack, and it runs super close to that 2x4 there that's going up to the roof. So all those yellow arrows are just pointing out the wooden elements, and that's not even the end of it. This was just at this certain point in construction, and I thought it was neat to take a picture to show you the wood that is going in and how, thinking about how they would be able to make it up into other wooden elements of the structure. You also see some plumbing penetrations kind of in the lower right-hand part of the photograph, which, by the way, were moved a couple times. So that's another thing. After you do a pre-treat, if you do a liquid pre-treat, oftentimes they won't tell you when they have to break open the slab. The builders won't tell you that they had to break open the slab and move the plumbing once, twice, 3 times sometimes. And that's really unfortunate. Now, lucky for me, I know what's needed, so I made sure that it was, treated appropriately each time they had to break my slab because they were damaging, the liquid pre-treat beneath. But keep that in mind with plumbing penetrations. You might think that, well, if a pre-treat went down, everything is perfect. Well, nothing is perfect at all, and we never really know the whole story of a structure. So wrapping up with some key points to think about. We'll talk about misapplications versus missed applications. So there's a simple fact that even the best products, and there are a lot of great products out there, if they're not applied to where the termites will contact them, they will not work. They just won't. Think about the example of the termite of maybe you're treating with a liquid and you hit overpour and you think it's the top of the footer, but the real top of the footer is another 6 to 12 inches below that. If your termites are already getting into the structure 6 or 12 inches below that treatment zone, and maybe they already have an established route of entry because they're loving their cellulose gold mine, which is the structure itself, they're not going to stop feasting on their cellulose gold mine, the structure, to just randomly wander around and get in your treatment. Don't get me wrong, there will be some random foraging that goes on, and that may certainly help and be to your advantage with your treatments. They may randomly get into them, but you can't count on partial or half done, if you will, just because of a simple mistake of not knowing where the top of the footer was. You can't count on termites always wandering into your treatment. You must get the product to where the termites are. And you got to keep in mind there's been a bunch of studies on it. There could be multiple genetically different colonies that could be active in a single structure, and maybe they don't interact with each other at all. So you might have to find where they are getting in, or you definitely, not might, you have to find where they're getting in, and you got to get the product to that point of entry or to at least that site of activity to further your efforts and have a more successful treatment. Inspection is the most important part of the job, hands down. Finding the infestation, if there is one, and finding the real top of the footer. Make sure you have the right tools to do so. A plumbing probe is fantastic. It's made of fiberglass. It doesn't conduct electricity, just in case. Just in case you run into some live wires, you'll thank me later as long as you don't have a metal probe. Try to find a fiberglass probe. And if roots or pipes are in your way, don't skip that area and think it's okay because you think you're using the best product ever. You got to dig around them as much as possible. Maybe use your rod or use the backfill method if needed. And remember, nature wants to fill in the holes that you create. If you take out one colony, another will most likely come along to take its place. So make sure your treatment is as complete as possible to intercept the advancing armies, if you will, of termites as they reach your customer's structure. And lastly, on communication, and which I always try to tie communication in whatever our topic of discussion is for the day. There's nothing wrong with asking the homeowner questions. In fact, it's one of your more important ways of building relationships. Quiz the homeowner on structural issues. Have they had any leaks? How about roof damage? Have they had any trees removed, or are there trees close to the property? And how about stumps left in the ground? Or have they noticed a mildew smell? This might sound like a bunch of random questions, but they're very important to ask. And it shows that you're interested and that you truly want to solve an issue and do the best job possible for them. Keep in mind that we all, again, we're not perfect, and we might have some selective memory. So try to walk your homeowner back, not just 3 months, 6 months. Ask them if they remember having a plumber come in the last 5 years. Or have they ever had to have a part of their roof repaired? Or have they noticed a leak underneath their sink? Or have they been wiping up some drips underneath their kitchen sink, for example, and they just didn't know where it was coming from? Try to walk them through to jar their memory, because a lot of us only think maybe 3 to 6 months ago, so you need to walk them back a little further. And go ahead and feel free to add these questions. If you don't already have a whole slew of questions on your inspection forms and your graphs, add some questions to these documents to get your sales guys and gals, your inspection teams, your technician teams to talk to your customers. Talking is the best way to build a relationship with them. So I want to take a minute and thank everybody who's attended. We are going to take some questions now, but I want to thank PMP and for my company, CSI, for allowing us to do this today, and thank all of you guys for your time and attention. I hope that you had some good takeaway points. Always feel free to contact me. My email's on the screen there, as well as my Twitter. Tweet at me. Come on over to social media. And I guess I'll turn it over to Will for some questions.
All right, and we want to thank Marie again for doing this. It was a great presentation. Like she said, we have a few questions here. I'm going to start with some of the ones that came in before the webinar. The first question I have here is, what do you see changing in the next 5 to 10 years related to this subject?
That is a broad question. Well, what do I see changing in the next 5 to 10 years? Building codes are always going to change. So whether or not that ropes pest management professionals into some of the changes, I'm not sure, but it actually wouldn't be a bad thing. Products are going to change and evolve. We may lose some products that we're used to using. We may gain some new products, maybe new chemistry that we haven't used before. There could be some new insight on termites in general, maybe behavior. There could be developments in mechanical exclusion of termites from buildings. But one of the, I think something from my heart that I would really like to see is right now, it's still generally across the country. So if you're in an area where builders, contractors, and architects work really well with pest management professionals, then you're very blessed. But most of the country, unfortunately, I'm going to talk about pre-treats and just pre-treats right now for a second. It's really where the low man on the totem pole kind of left as this just necessary thing that has to get done to be checked off to get a CO, a certificate of occupancy. And I would really like to see more of an open forum between PMPs, maybe at the state level, interacting more with your contractors associations and your builders groups and associations to help maybe highlight the importance of our work in relation to their work. So I would like to see some changes where more emphasis is put on proper pre-treatments, as well as maybe some advances in construction, taking a look at how it would be beneficial in keeping our structures a little less susceptible to termites.
So that's kind of a really broad question and probably more of an existential answer, but hopefully that helped. That helped a little bit.
Here's one a little less broad. How reliable do you think blueprints are in planning and treatment?
Oh, I love blueprints. Are they reliable? It depends. It's awesome if your homeowner has a set of blueprints. It can really help you with measurements. So whatever treatment you're doing, whether you're baiting or you're doing liquid treatment, you need that linear footage measurement, and that can really help give you an exact measurement of the structure. But keep in mind that some changes may have taken place to that structure. So you never know what could have happened since that structure was built. If the homeowner is a single owner of it and they have the original blueprints and nothing has changed, then they might be quite helpful. It's also helpful when you're doing any type of interior work and you need to keep away from maybe some hot electrical areas. So it can show you where the lines are actually run. I know looking at my blueprints over the last year, it was pretty exact. I mean, that might just have been the group we worked with, but pictures of our naked walls before the drywall went up show all the electrical lines run, and they mirror the plan almost to a T of our blueprints. So blueprints can be helpful, but don't rely solely on them. Communicate with your homeowner to find out if any changes have been made, and at a very minimum, they'll be helpful, especially for that linear measurement around the outside of the structure.
All right. We have another question here about employing dogs to sniff out termites. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think that dogs are great. Number one, I have 3. They can't really sniff out anything other than what you're eating to beg for it. But for termite dogs, canine assistants in general for pest control are some pretty specialized employees, if you will. And in order to maintain, whether it's a termite sniffing dog, which I do believe, as long as they're maintained properly, and by that I mean there's a lot of steps. I don't work with them personally, but I have had a lot of customers through the years who have them and swear by them. But they also have shared with me that maintaining them and their level of accuracy is a daily effort, which means, collecting, in the case of termite dogs, collecting termites and testing the dog and rewarding the dog and doing it exactly in the manner that the initial group that you may have gotten the termite dog from, the way that they train the dog. So they are, a lot of studies have been done at different universities. They can be spot on, but you can't expect a termite dog, to keep up their training, if you will, if you don't help them in that effort. I hope I'm making sense. And the same goes for bed bugs, or when you're using canines for anything in pest management. It's a repeated process, and you have to keep them fresh, and you have to keep them trained, in whatever their method of detection is. So I think they're great. That's how I feel about them. But I also think there's a really heavy responsibility on the companies that have these dogs, because you want to keep them in tip-top form so that they're going to serve you well and not maybe give you some false positives or mistakenly identify things. And it would be the owner's fault, in my opinion, for not keeping their training up. So I do know it's definitely a dedicated endeavor when you take on a termite dog, but I think they're great.
All right. This is a question that just came through, and I think it's a good one. I think this will probably be the last one we can take the time we have left. Do plumbing pipes run inside or under the monolithic foundation slab?
they come up from the soil, up from underneath. So like you saw in the picture, I know that mine were in the soil, and then they stuck up out of the soil, and the slab was poured around them. They put those 12-inch or more diameter cardboard tubes, around the groups of pipes, and then they poured the slab. Now they can also go through block. I can tell you that I have a shower area and tub area that is flanked by 2 external walls. It's on a corner. And they had to bust open my block and run piping up through the block and then patch and fill with concrete. So it can be a mix, if you will. But for my particular case that I've just been experiencing over the last year, they're coming up from underneath, coming through the slab. But I'm sure there are cases where they're actually encased in the slab. And in that case, it may or may not show on the on blueprints, and it would be definitely something to think about, especially if you're going to drill through slabs, because you definitely wouldn't want to drill into any of the plumbing elements that could be in the slab. But from my experience, they're coming up through the slab from the soil underneath.
All right. I think that's about all we have time for, unless there's anything else you'd like to add, Marie?
No. I hope that everybody enjoyed it, and not sure when our next one's going to be, but we will have one closer to summer, I think. Right, Will?
I believe so, and we will keep you posted. You can check on our website or our Facebook page. And if your question did not get answered by Marie, you can contact her, as she said, at her email address, and I'm sure she would be happy to help you. So signing off, this is Will Nepper, once again, Managing Editor of PMP Magazine, and I will hand it back over to Rick.
Okay. Thank you for attending our webinar. A recording of this webinar will be posted on the Pest Management Professional website and will be emailed to you 2 weeks from today. Please visit Pest Management Professional for future events like this one. Thank you for attending, and have a nice afternoon.